In the summer heat of 1954, when the air above the bayou shimmered like melting glass and the cicadas screamed in the cypress trees, a boy was born behind the walls of a plantation house that history tried to forget. His mother was a secret, his father a legend, and his birth an abomination whispered only in candlelight. They called him the Mistress's boy, though no one dared to speak his name in daylight. They said the boy's first cry echoed through the old parlor like a curse, long, trembling, and sharp enough to make the servants cross themselves. The midwife, an old Creole woman named Celeste, was sworn to silence by a man in a white linen suit who smelled of bourbon and power. That man was Charles Beauregard III, heir to the largest sugar plantation in southern Louisiana, a man whose name carried weight in politics, in pulpits, and in every parlor from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. But in that one silent, sweaty night, Charles's name became tied to something he could never speak of publicly. A son born not of his wife, but of his mistress, a young housemaid named Evelyn Dupré. But before we continue this disturbing story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves hidden stories. It helps bring more of these untold truths to light. Evelyn had come to the Beauregard estate at 17, barefoot and quiet, with eyes that could make a man feel both seen and accused at once. She worked the washing lines behind the kitchen, sang softly in Creole, and was known for having a calmness that unsettled people who carried guilt in their hearts. Charles noticed her the way a fire notices dry grass. Their affair began with excuses, letters, late-night errands, and eventually, the soft creak of the staircase that led to the servants' quarters. By 1954, the affair had become more than lust, it had become dangerous. Charles's wife, Margaret, daughter of a powerful judge, was known for her devotion to appearances. Her charity balls, her pearls, her forced smile, everything about her said control. When she discovered Evelyn's pregnancy, control became fury. But divorce was unthinkable in those circles, and scandal could destroy generations. So Margaret did what Southern wives of her kind often did. She hid behind her mirrors and told her husband that the problem must disappear. Evelyn was sent away before the child came. They told the staff she had fallen ill and gone to stay with relatives in Lafayette. In truth, Charles bought her a small cabin near the edge of the swamp, where the fog was thick and the sound of frogs could drown out a newborn's cries. He visited her at night, bringing food, blankets, and guilt wrapped in silence. When the boy was born, Charles saw his own face staring back at him, and something else too, something he didn't want to name. The boy's eyes weren't blue like his. They were a strange shade of amber, almost gold, and when the midwife held him up, even Charles stepped back. "He's got the devil's eyes," Celeste muttered. Evelyn slapped her hand away. "He's got his father's eyes," she said. But Charles said nothing. For the next few years, that cabin became a ghost house no one dared to mention. Evelyn raised her son, Samuel, with a kind of fierce, quiet love that burned through the loneliness. She taught him Creole songs, told him stories of spirits that lived in the swamp, and warned him never to go near the big house on the hill. "That's a place where ghosts wear shoes," she'd say, "and they don't like to be reminded they're dead." But children are born with curiosity stronger than fear. At 6, Samuel began to ask questions. Why did people in town stare at him? Why did they whisper? Why did he have to hide when the fancy cars came down the dirt road? Evelyn would brush his hair, look him in the eyes, and whisper, "Because you belong to two worlds, and neither one wants you." Meanwhile, the Beauregard plantation began to rot from the inside. Charles grew older, heavier, and more desperate. The sugar business was dying. Machines were replacing men, and debts were mounting. Margaret's bitterness became a disease that infected the walls. The servants left one by one, saying the house had too many eyes at night. In 1961, a hurricane swept across the bayou, tearing roofs from the old cabins and flooding the cane fields. The Beauregard mansion survived, but the land around it turned to swamp. For 3 days, Evelyn and Samuel huddled together as the water rose around their cabin. When the storm cleared, the world had changed. Evelyn fell ill soon after, coughing blood into her hands, refusing a doctor because no white man's medicine can cure what the Lord meant to end. Charles came only once after that. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking at the boy who now looked almost his height. "I'll make sure you're taken care of," he said, voice thick with the weight of things left unsaid. But Evelyn shook her head. "You've done enough, Charles. Don't make him your shame twice." When Evelyn died that winter, Samuel buried her by the edge of the swamp with his own hands. He was 12. No preacher, no neighbors, no one but the croaking frogs and the sigh of the wind through the cypress. Afterward, he walked up the hill to the Beauregard mansion for the first time. He stood outside its iron gate and stared at the long porch, at the shuttered windows, and at the man standing on the balcony with a glass of whiskey in his hand. Charles didn't come down. He simply looked at the boy, and the boy looked back. No words. Just two faces divided by a century of sin and silence. Then Charles turned and went inside. For months, Samuel tried to live alone in that cabin, surviving off the swamp. He hunted, fished, and listened to the distant trains that carried other people to places he'd never see. He started carving wooden figures, faces mostly. Some were kind. Some looked like his mother. But one face, the one he carved again and again, was his father's. And every time he finished one, he'd throw it into the water, watching it float away until the swamp swallowed it. By the time he was 16, rumors began to spread. Folks in town said they'd seen the swamp boy sneaking into abandoned homes at night, stealing candles and books. Others said he was half wild, that he spoke to ghosts. The truth was simpler. Samuel was hungry. For food, for belonging, for the kind of love that didn't die on a rotting mattress in a floodplain. In 1968, during one of his rare trips into town, Samuel was caught stealing bread from a general store. The sheriff recognized him instantly. The face, the eyes, the Beauregard jawline. Charles was called to the station. He arrived in his Cadillac, hat low, face pale. The sheriff said, "You know who this is, don't you?" Charles hesitated, then said quietly, "No, never seen him before." Samuel didn't say a word. He just stared at him until the sheriff finally muttered, "Boy's got nowhere to go." Charles turned to leave but paused at the door. "Then send him back to the swamp," he said, and walked out into the sunlight. That night, Samuel ran. He didn't go back to the cabin. He went deeper into the bayou, where the water was black and the trees bent like mourners. Locals swore they saw his lantern flickering between the reeds for weeks after, but no one ever approached. Some said he drowned. Others said he became part of the swamp itself, a spirit that haunted the Beauregard land. But a year later, in 1969, the Beauregard mansion burned to the ground. The fire started in the middle of the night, spreading fast through the wooden beams and velvet curtains. Charles was found dead in his study, clutching a photograph of a young woman with dark eyes and a smile that could have belonged to either heaven or hell. The official report called it an accident, faulty wiring. But those who knew the family whispered a different story. They said a boy with golden eyes had been seen walking away from the flames, barefoot, carrying a wooden carving in his hand. And they said that when the fire reached the top floor, someone heard laughter, not wild or cruel, but free, like someone who had finally come home. In the years that followed, the land was abandoned. Vines claimed the iron gates, moss swallowed the stones, and the Beauregard name disappeared from the parish records. But every summer, when the air turns heavy and the cicadas begin to scream, the locals say you can still see a light moving through the swamp, a single lantern swaying slowly in the dark, as if someone were still looking for something he never found. Some call it a ghost. Others say it's a curse. But in Louisiana, stories have long memories. And some sons never really die. They just wait for the world to remember them. They found the first bones in the spring of 1975, 6 years after the fire. The flood had carried them out from the black soil of the Beauregard property, washing them downstream until a fisherman's net caught on something that wasn't supposed to be there. The sheriff, a man named Clay Dufresne, came out with his deputies, trying not to gag from the smell of rot that still clung to the earth. What they uncovered wasn't just human. It was history clawing its way back to the surface. The remains were fragile, half-eaten by mud and time, but one thing stood out: a gold cufflink still clinging to a burned scrap of linen. On its surface, despite the tarnish, you could still see the engraved letter, B. Beauregard. The newspapers had moved on by then. New Orleans was loud with music, protests, and the new world of color TVs and politics. Nobody cared about old plantation ghosts. But in St. Landry Parish, The whispers started again. Folks remembered the boy, the one with the strange eyes, the one whose mother had died in the swamp, the one who had vanished just before the fire. Sheriff Clay had been a deputy when the mansion burned down. He remembered the sight, the smell of sugar and ash, the way the flames bent like they knew the house's secrets, and he remembered the photograph they'd found in Charles Beauregard's hand. Evelyn Dupre, even burned, her beauty had survived the fire. Clay had always wondered what the real story was, but in Louisiana, there are questions you don't ask unless you want the swamp to answer. But that spring, when those bones surfaced, something stirred the ghosts again. The land had changed hands, sold to an oil company that wanted to drain the old fields. And when the bulldozers came, they unearthed more than soil. They uncovered graves. Not one but several, small hidden pits filled with the bones of people who weren't supposed to exist. At first they thought it might be slaves from the old days, buried without record. But the condition of the bones told a different story. Modern, violent bullet holes, rope marks, something darker than history. Clay Dufresne knew he'd have to report it, but deep down he knew that once he opened that door, the Beauregard curse would walk right back out. He sat that night in his office, staring at the evidence, photographs, reports, the tarnished cufflink. The rain outside hit the windows like small persistent ghosts. Then, around midnight, he got a call. The voice was old, female, and trembling. "You found them bones, didn't you, Sheriff?" He frowned. "Who's this?" "This is Celeste, the midwife. I brung that boy into this world. You best stop digging, Sheriff. The dead don't like being moved." Clay leaned forward. "Celeste Dupre? I thought you passed years ago." "I did," she said softly. "Least that's what they told folks. But I've been waiting. Been waiting for the Lord to finish what he started in that house." Then her tone shifted, deepened. "He's back, Sheriff. I seen him. Same eyes, same blood. Walking the roads when the fog rolls in." The line went dead. Clay sat there for a long time, listening to the rain and the hum of the fluorescent light above him. He told himself it was just the ramblings of an old woman. But part of him, the part that still remembered that fire, knew she wasn't lying. 2 weeks later, the oil company's work came to a sudden halt. Their equipment kept breaking down. Workers quit after claiming they saw figures moving in the mist, shapes that looked almost human but not quite. One man swore he saw a boy standing knee-deep in the water, holding something small and wooden in his hand. When he blinked, it was gone, and then came the letter. It arrived at the parish office with no return address. Just a single name scrawled across the envelope: Samuel. Inside was a short note, written in a careful, practiced hand. "You buried lies beneath my mother's grave. You can dig all you want, but the swamp remembers. Tell Clay I'm coming home." The sheriff's hands trembled as he read it. The paper was damp, smelled faintly of smoke and bayou water. He drove out to the old Beauregard property the next morning, against every voice in his head that told him not to. The house, or what was left of it, stood like a skeleton against the gray sky. Vines hung from its charred beams, the iron gates rusted shut. The swamp had taken everything back except the memory of what it had devoured. He walked slowly through what used to be the parlor, boots sinking into mud. The ground was littered with glass, nails, and bones of small animals. Then he saw it, something half buried under a cypress root. He knelt and brushed away the dirt. It was a small wooden carving. A man's face, hollow eyes, sharp jaw. He didn't have to guess whose face it was. When he stood up, the wind carried a sound through the trees, a faint hum, almost a lullaby. Old Creole sung in a woman's voice, Evelyn's song. Clay turned, his pulse racing. There was no one there, only fog curling through the ruins like breath. That night he couldn't sleep. He poured whiskey, stared at the cufflink on his desk, and tried to make sense of what he'd seen. His deputy, a young man named Eddie, stopped by. "Sheriff," Eddie said quietly, "you ought to see this." He laid a photograph on the desk. It was taken at a gas station security camera on the highway outside Lafayette. A man, mid-30s maybe, with dark skin, worn clothes, and eyes that glowed faintly in the camera's flash. "Guy paid with an old silver dollar," Eddie said. "Had a scar right here." He pointed to the man's jawline, same place Charles Beauregard had that old dueling scar. Clay whispered, "Samuel Dupre." Eddie frowned. You mean the boy from the fire? Sheriff, that was over 20 years ago. I know what I mean, Clay said, voice low, and I know what I saw in those woods. In the months that followed, strange things began to happen in St. Landry Parish. Livestock went missing. Crosses were found carved into trees near the swamp. People whispered about a figure seen wandering at dusk, a man who never spoke, but whose shadow looked too long for his body. One night, Clay returned to the Beauregard site with a lantern and his service revolver. He didn't tell anyone. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of wet earth. He followed the narrow trail to the spot where Evelyn Dupree had been buried all those years ago. The grave marker was gone. In its place, a new wooden carving stood, freshly cut, smooth and shining with sap. It was the face of a woman, eyes closed, peaceful. He knelt to touch it. Beneath the carving, written in charcoal, were 4 words: "She sleeps, I wake." Clay backed away slowly, his heart pounding. Then he heard it, a splash, followed by footsteps through the water. He turned, lantern trembling in his hand. "Who's there?" He called out. Silence. Then from the fog, a voice, deep, calm, and eerily familiar. "You came too late, Sheriff." The light flickered. For a moment Clay saw him, a tall man, barefoot, clothes soaked from the swamp, golden eyes reflecting the lantern's flame. His face was older now, hardened, but unmistakable. "Samuel, what do you want?" Clay asked, his voice breaking. Samuel tilted his head slightly. "Justice." "For what?" "For a name that was buried. For a mother they erased. And for a father who burned his sins instead of confessing them." Clay took a step forward. "You can't fight ghosts, son." Samuel's expression darkened. "Who said I was fighting them?" The wind rose suddenly, carrying the smell of smoke and sugar. For a second, Clay thought he saw flames curling around Samuel's silhouette, but when he blinked, the figure was gone. Only the swamp remained, still and silent. He stumbled back to his truck and drove off, heart pounding, hands shaking. But as he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw it. A faint orange glow rising behind the trees, flickering like firelight. By morning, the graveyard behind the Beauregard ruins was nothing but ash. The parish called it vandalism. Teenagers, maybe. But Clay knew better. He'd seen the look in those eyes, the calm fury of a man who had waited his whole life for the world to remember what it had tried to bury. And as he stood on the hill that once overlooked the Beauregard estate, he realized something that chilled him to his core. The swamp wasn't haunting the Beauregards. The Beauregards were haunting him. That night, he opened his office drawer and found the wooden carving he'd brought back, the man's face with hollow eyes. But now there was something carved on the back that hadn't been there before. A message burned into the wood. "Tell them the blood still burns." Clay Dufresne poured himself another glass of whiskey, staring into the darkness beyond the window. Somewhere out there, the Louisiana Mistress's son was still walking, still watching, still waiting for the last lie to be dug up. And if the swamp truly remembers, then the story isn't over yet. By the summer of 1976, the parish had grown tired of whispers. People wanted peace, not ghost stories. But peace never came to the land where the Beauregard house once stood. The swamp had grown thicker, heavier, as if the earth itself refused to breathe. Birds avoided it. Hunters said the air felt wrong, like the whole place was listening. Sheriff Clay Dufresne tried to move on. He told himself that Samuel Dupree was a myth, a shadow stitched together by grief and guilt. But late at night, when the wind blew from the direction of the bayou, he swore he could still smell the smoke from that old fire, still hear Evelyn Dupree's lullaby slipping through the cypress trees. Then, one August morning, the past returned, this time wearing a badge. A young state investigator named Raymond Cormier arrived from Baton Rouge, sent by the Attorney General's office to review historical irregularities concerning the Beauregard estate. He was polished, sharp, and skeptical. He'd read the reports, heard the rumors, and was determined to put them to rest. "Sheriff," he said, shaking Clay's hand firmly, "I'm here to clean up the record. Your county's been holding ghosts too long." Clay smirked wearily. "Around here, son, ghosts hold us." Raymond laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. The young investigator began by revisiting the remains found the previous year. The bones, the bullet holes, the missing persons that had been quietly brushed under the rug decades ago. But the deeper he dug, the stranger things became. Names of laborers who'd vanished between 1932 and 1940, women who'd worked as maids on the plantation and were never seen again, all connected to the Beauregards. And there was one name that kept reappearing on the old payroll ledgers, circled in red ink: E. Dupro, Evelyn. Raymond decided to visit the Beauregard ruins himself. Clay tried to dissuade him. "That land ain't right," he said. "It's hungry." But Raymond didn't listen. On August 9th, he parked his car at the edge of the property, stepped out into the thick, humid air, and started walking toward what used to be the great house. The swamp was louder than usual, frogs croaking, insects buzzing, like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of reach. He found the old foundation, blackened and cracked. Moss covered everything. He noticed something strange along the edges of the stones, symbols carved deep into the stonework, circles crossed with slashes. He crouched down to touch one. The carving was fresh. He stood quickly, scanning the trees. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. Only the wind moving through the willows. When he turned to leave, he saw it. A small wooden figure sitting on a fallen beam. A man's face, hollow eyes. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. On the back, carved roughly, were 4 words. "You shouldn't have come." Raymond dropped the carving and ran back to his car. When he looked over his shoulder one last time, he swore he saw a figure standing by the ruins, barefoot, watching. That night he went to the sheriff's office, pale and shaking. "There's someone out there," he said. "Someone's living on that land." Clay looked at him quietly, then poured him a glass of whiskey. "You saw him, didn't you?" Raymond hesitated. "I don't know what I saw." Clay leaned forward. "You saw the boy." "That's impossible," Raymond said. "He'd be what, 30, 40 by now?" "Doesn't matter," Clay said. "That land don't care about years. It keeps what it wants." Raymond tried to laugh it off, but the sheriff's expression didn't change. Finally he sighed. "Fine, say he's alive. Then what does he want?" Clay looked out the window toward the black stretch of trees beyond town. "He wants someone to listen." 2 days later, a priest from Lafayette arrived in town, Father Marcel Thibodeau, an old man with deep eyes and a voice that carried weight. He claimed to have been contacted by someone who needed spiritual mediation concerning the Beauregard land. He said his name was Samuel, the priest told Clay. Said he needed confession, but not for forgiveness, for witness. The sheriff felt a chill crawl down his spine. "When was this?" "Last night," the priest said. He never came to the church, though. Said he'd wait where it all began. The 3 men, Clay, Raymond, and Father Marcel, set out together before sunset. The drive was silent. By the time they reached the swamp road, the fog was rolling in thick, glowing faintly under the dying orange light. When they reached the ruins, night was falling. The crickets had gone silent. The world felt paused, waiting. "Samuel," the priest called softly. "It's Father Marcel. You asked for me." At first, nothing. Then from the darkness beyond the ruins came a voice, steady, deep, and sorrowful. "You came." Samuel stepped into the light. His clothes were simple, worn. His hair streaked with gray. His eyes still that strange amber glow. Clay's breath caught. He looked both alive and not, as if the swamp itself had sculpted him back into being. Raymond instinctively reached for his pistol, but the sheriff stopped him. "Don't," Clay whispered. "He ain't here to hurt us." Samuel looked at the priest. "You wanted to hear my confession?" Father Marcel nodded slowly. "If that's what your soul needs." Samuel smiled faintly. "My soul's long gone, Father. What I need is truth." He began to speak. His voice was quiet, but every word carried through the humid night. He told them how his mother, Evelyn, had been betrayed, not just by Charles Beauregard, but by the entire family. How she'd discovered that the Beauregards were using the swamp for more than sugar, smuggling, debts, and darker things. The missing workers weren't missing. They'd been buried beneath the cane fields, victims of greed and secrecy. Evelyn had found out. She wanted to go to the authorities. Charles couldn't let her, so he'd poisoned her slowly, sweet tea laced with arsenic. Samuel's voice trembled when he said it. She kept coughing, thinking it was the swamp air. He came every night, pretending to care, pretending to help. and I watched her die, bit by bit. I didn't understand then, but when I did, I burned his world to the ground. Raymond swallowed hard. You killed your father. Samuel looked at him calmly. No, I freed him. The house was his cage. The fire just opened the door. Clay stepped forward. And the others? The graves? Samuel's eyes lifted toward the trees. I didn't put them there, Sheriff. I just made sure they were found. The priest crossed himself, whispering a prayer. What do you want from us now, Samuel? He looked down at his hands, then back up. Names, justice, for the ones no one remembers. He handed Clay a folded piece of paper. They kept a book in the mansion, a ledger, names of everyone they buried. It's still out there, under the floor where my mother died. Then he turned toward the swamp. That's all I came to say. Wait, Clay called after him. Where will you go? Samuel didn't answer. He just stepped into the fog until the night swallowed him whole. They searched for the ledger the next day. Beneath what used to be the servant quarters, under broken boards and vines, they found it. A weathered, half-burned book wrapped in oilcloth. Inside pages of names, dates, and wages. Men and women, black and white, buried without ceremony for decades. Evidence of murder, corruption, and silence spanning generations. When Raymond brought it back to Baton Rouge, it sparked investigations, lawsuits, and headlines that finally forced Louisiana to reckon with the sins of its past. But Sheriff Clay knew better. History doesn't repent, it just hides behind new curtains. Weeks later, Father Marcel found an envelope sitting on the steps of his church. Inside was a single wooden carving, a woman's face peaceful and sleeping. Beneath it, carved words. She rests now. That same night, Clay sat alone on his porch, sipping bourbon as the summer rain fell. He watched the mist rising from the bayou, the lightning flickering in the distance. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter, cleaner, as if something had finally exhaled. But just as he began to close his eyes, he saw it, a faint lantern light moving through the swamp. Slow, steady, familiar, and from somewhere far away, he could hear the soft sound of a lullaby carried on the wind, Evelyn's song, gentle and haunting. Clay smiled sadly, set down his glass, and whispered into the rain, "Rest easy, son." But deep in the swamp, the lantern kept moving, neither fading nor growing closer, just drifting, forever watching. Because in Louisiana, the dead don't leave. They linger in the air, in the mud, in the stories people try to forget. And every now and then, when the night is still enough, the swamp remembers the son of a mistress who refused to be erased. The summer of 1982 came to Louisiana heavy and strange. The air was thick enough to choke, and the cypress trees swayed as if whispering gossip about the living. In St. Augustine Parish, it wasn't just the heat that made people uneasy. There were rumors about old sins resurfacing, about a house that had once been filled with music and love now standing silent, like a coffin left open too long. And at the center of those whispers was a name people spoke with caution, as if saying it might summon ghosts. Elias Merrow, the son of the Louisiana Mistress. By now, Elias was a man in his 30s, though his life had worn him into something older. He carried the kind of face you couldn't forget, tired, angular, with eyes that looked as if they'd seen too much and trusted too little. For years he'd worked the sugar mills down by the river, trying to live quietly. But quiet never stayed with him long. He was the son of Clara Beaumont, and in Louisiana, blood had a way of refusing to disappear. When Clara died, she left behind more than grief. She left behind questions. The night before her funeral, a storm tore through the parish. The locals said they saw strange lights near the old Beaumont estate, flashes of lanterns moving through the trees. The next morning, the caretaker found the cellar door open. The lock snapped clean. Inside, the air reeked of something old and metallic, like rust and regret. Among the broken furniture and dust, Elias found a small tin box. Inside it lay photographs, faded Polaroids of his mother with Judge Beaumont. But there was one that froze his breath. A picture of a little boy, maybe 4 years old, sitting on the judge's lap. A silver bracelet on his wrist engraved with the initials H.B. Elias's hand trembled as he held it. H.B. Henry Beaumont. The legitimate son, and yet, in that photograph, the boy looked nothing like the Beaumonts. He had the same dark curls, the same amber eyes Elias saw every morning in the mirror. The revelation wasn't just personal. It was dangerous. It meant one thing. The Beaumont family had lied, not just about Elias's birth, but about who their real heir was. The next few days were a blur of funeral arrangements and half-whispered conversations. The white folks from town came to pay their respects, though most just wanted a look at the mistress's bastard son who had returned. They lingered outside beneath the hanging moss, fanning themselves and pretending to mourn. Inside the church, Elias stood alone by the casket. Clara looked peaceful for the first time in years. Her hands, frail and delicate, were folded over her chest. Around her neck hung the locket she never removed, the one that once held a photo of the judge. As the pastor spoke, Elias noticed a man in the back pew watching him, a stranger in a linen suit, clean-shaven with eyes too sharp for a mourner. After the service, the man approached. "You're Elias," he said. "I worked for your mother once." Elias frowned. "Who are you?" The man introduced himself as Calvin Rhodes, a former clerk in Judge Beaumont's office. "Your mother made me promise. If she passed before she could tell you herself, I'd give you something." From his coat pocket, Calvin produced an envelope yellowed with age. Inside was a letter written in Clara's delicate hand. "My dearest boy," it read, "if you are reading this, I am gone. The truth I carried was too heavy to bear alone. The Beaumonts ruined lives to protect their name, yours most of all. What you were told about your father is not the truth. Go to the courthouse in New Orleans. There you'll find the sealed file. Beaumont Estate vs. Marrow, 1953. It will tell you everything." Elias read it 3 times before looking up. "Why now?" Calvin sighed. "Because the people who buried your mother's name think time has buried their sins. But you've got her eyes, son. You see through things, and now they'll see through you." That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch of the decaying house, the crickets singing like broken clocks, and the memory of his mother's voice echoing in his head. He remembered her once telling him, "Truth is like river water. Eli, you can dam it for a while, but sooner or later, it finds its way through." The next morning, he packed a bag and drove to New Orleans. The courthouse was a marble relic of another time, echoing halls, stained glass windows, the smell of paper and dust. When Elias presented Clara's letter to the clerk, the man hesitated, then disappeared into the archives. Minutes later, he returned with a thick brown file marked confidential. Inside were documents, property ledgers, medical reports, and something that made Elias's stomach turn: birth records, 2 of them. One for Henry Beaumont, born July 14, 1949. One for Elias Marrow, born July 14, 1949, same date, same hospital, same attending physician, Dr. Joseph Harlan. But on Elias's file, the section marked mother was typed as unknown domestic servant. Elias stared in disbelief. "They switched the names," he whispered. The judge had done the unthinkable, switched his legitimate and illegitimate sons. He wasn't the mistress's son, he was the Beaumont heir. The revelation hit him like a hurricane. For years he'd been spat on, shunned, treated as the dirty secret of Louisiana's upper crust. And now he realized he'd been their secret treasure, hidden to protect their image. Elias's hands shook as he turned the final page of the file. There, clipped to the last report, was a photograph of Judge Beaumont holding 2 infants. The caption on the back read, "July 1949, both safe and sound." He felt the floor sway beneath him. The truth wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. His whole life had been rewritten to preserve another man's name. That night, he stayed in a small motel outside the city. Rain battered the windows, and the neon sign outside flickered like a dying heart. He stared into the cracked mirror and whispered to himself, "Who am I really?" The reflection didn't answer, but in the silence he heard the echo of his mother's voice again. Days turned to weeks as Elias tried to make sense of what to do. He knew if he went public, the Beaumont family would crush him. They still had power, old money, deep connections, and a reputation they'd kill to protect. But something inside him had awakened, something his mother had buried out of fear. He began digging. Through courthouse records, newspaper clippings, old parish registries, and the more he found, the more monstrous the story became. Judge Beaumont had arranged 2 births, one under Clara's name, one under his wife's. The infants were swapped in secret. When the judge's legitimate son fell ill as an infant, the nurse who knew the truth died in a mysterious carriage accident. Elias realized what that meant. The woman who raised Henry Beaumont as her own had been living a lie too. He had to see him, the man who'd lived his life. Henry Beaumont was everything Elias was not. Polished, wealthy, confident. He owned the family's old law firm and lived in a French Quarter mansion overlooking the river. To the public, he was a philanthropist, but Elias saw through the photographs. Behind the smiles was arrogance, the same cold superiority that had defined their father. He watched from afar for days before finally confronting him. One humid evening, he waited by the river road near the gates of the Beaumont estate. When Henry's car slowed to a stop, Elias stepped out of the shadows. "Evening," he said quietly. Henry blinked. "Do I know you?" Elias smiled faintly. "You should. We share a birthday." Henry frowned. "You're the one from the papers, aren't you?" The bastard, the word sliced deeper than he expected, but Elias didn't flinch. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm the one who was supposed to have everything you've got." Henry laughed, a hollow, practiced sound. "And what do you plan to do with that story?" "Blackmail. You think anyone will believe a mill worker over a Beaumont?" Elias took a step closer, his voice low and calm. "I don't need them to believe me. I just need them to see you." For a long moment, neither spoke. The cicadas hummed, the river groaned, and thunder rolled somewhere distant. Then Henry's smile faded. "You don't know what you're starting," he said coldly. "This family has survived worse than you." Elias looked him in the eye. "Not this time." In the following weeks, strange things began to happen in St. Augustine. Documents vanished from the courthouse. The local paper received anonymous envelopes containing fragments of the truth. Old photos, signed affidavits, medical ledgers, and people started talking. It wasn't long before the Beaumont name began to rot in public. The law firm shut its doors, temporarily. The mansion's windows were boarded up. Henry's wife left for Atlanta, and through it all, Elias stayed silent, watching from a distance as the empire built on lies began to collapse. But vengeance, as he soon learned, doesn't always bring peace. One night, he received a call. The voice on the other end trembled. "This is Sheriff Langley. I think you need to come down to the river." Elias drove through the storm in silence. When he arrived, the flashing lights reflected on the black water. The deputies stood around something half-submerged near the dock. It was Henry Beaumont, his car half in the water, door open, his body motionless. The sheriff looked uneasy. "Looks like he lost control." But Elias saw the bruises on Henry's knuckles, the missing watch from his wrist, and the faint smell of alcohol that didn't match the clean river breeze. He didn't say a word. He just turned, staring out at the river, the same river that had carried every secret of this cursed family for generations. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread. Some said Henry had killed himself out of guilt. Others whispered that Elias had finally avenged his mother. The truth, like the river, ran deep and unseen. Elias never spoke of that night again. He buried the tin box under the old oak near his mother's grave. Then he left Louisiana, driving west until the bayous faded behind him and the air grew dry. He found work again in Texas, living under another name. Some nights he'd sit by the window of his rented room, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and he'd think of the woman who loved him enough to die with her secret. Clara Beaumont's son. The mistress's boy. The rightful heir. The story of Louisiana had always been one of blood, and in the end, every drop found its way home. The road stretched endlessly west, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through miles of quiet dust. Elias Merrow, though he no longer went by that name, had driven until Louisiana was just a memory behind him. The swamps gave way to plains, the scent of river moss fading into the dryness of open air. Yet no distance was far enough to silence the ghosts that followed him. They rode in the back seat of his rusted Chevy, his mother's voice, the judge's shadow, Henry's dead eyes beneath the river's sheen. By 1984, Elias was living under a false name in a small Texas town called Edenfield. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time. One main street, a diner that smelled of fried okra, and a church bell that tolled every evening at 6. He worked as a mechanic, keeping to himself, saying little. People liked him fine. Enough, though they sensed something about him, something that made them keep their distance. He changed his name to Eli Carter after his mother's maiden middle name. To the town, he was just another drifter who'd settled long enough to be familiar but never close. But at night, when the crickets sang and the desert wind rattled the windows, Eli would sit by the oil lamp, rereading the few things he'd kept from Louisiana, the faded photo of his mother, the bracelet marked H, B, and a yellowed letter signed in her careful hand. The letter was what tethered him. It was both a curse and a comfort, a reminder that truth, no matter how painful, was worth surviving for. Then one day, the past found him again. It was a Wednesday when a stranger walked into his garage, a woman, maybe in her late 20s, dressed too fine for the dust roads of Edenfield. Her car, a black Pontiac, had broken down 5 miles out of town. When Eli popped the hood, she smiled faintly. "You work fast?" "Depends what's broken," he muttered, wiping his hands on a rag. Her eyes studied him a moment too long. "You from around here?" Eli shook his head. "Now I am." She hesitated before replying. "My name's Margaret Beaumont." The name hit like a blade. He froze, the wrench clattering to the ground. She noticed. "You've heard it before?" Eli forced a half-smile. "Louisiana's full of Beaumonts." She nodded slowly. "Maybe. But not many with the judge's blood." The air between them thickened. For a moment he swore she could hear his heartbeat. Margaret was Henry's younger sister, born years after Elias had left Louisiana. She had grown up hearing only fragments of the family scandal. After Henry's death, the Beaumont estate had collapsed into chaos. Lawsuits, unpaid debts, whispers of foul play. She'd spent years trying to piece together what had happened. And somehow that trail had led her here, to him. "I've been looking for you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "There are things you don't know. Things my father did that none of us were meant to find out." Eli looked away. "I know enough." "No," she insisted. "You don't." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder wrapped in old newspaper. Inside were court documents, letters, and something that made Eli's stomach twist. A coroner's report. "Henry didn't drown," she whispered. "He was dead before the car went into the water." Eli stared at the papers. Blunt force trauma. No water in the lungs. Margaret's eyes glistened. "Someone killed him, Eli." He swallowed hard. "And you think it was me?" She shook her head. "No, I think it was someone who wanted you both gone." They talked for hours in the small diner by the gas station. As the sun set, Margaret told him what she'd uncovered. After Judge Beaumont's death in 1962, most of his estate had been quietly transferred to offshore accounts. Decades later, the accounts were reactivated by someone using the alias Joseph Harlan, the same name as the doctor who'd delivered Elias and Henry in 1949. But Dr. Harlan had died in 1971, which meant someone was using his identity. Margaret leaned closer. "Whoever did this is still out there, Eli. Someone who knows the truth about the switch, and killed to keep it buried." Eli felt the old fire stir in his chest. The anger, the helplessness, the curse of being part of a story he never asked to live in. "Why come to me?" he asked quietly. "Because," she said, "you're the only one who can prove what really happened. You're the only living heir of the Beaumont bloodline." They drove back to Louisiana 2 days later. The old house still stood, half-eaten by vines, its shutters sagging, its windows blind with dust. The air was heavy with the smell of rot and memory. Margaret unlocked the door with a key she'd found in her mother's belongings. Inside, time had stopped. The piano still sat in the corner, yellow keys warped by humidity. On the mantel, a portrait of Judge Beaumont loomed, eyes stern, mouth cruel, as if he'd been waiting for them. Eli stood in the silence for a long moment. This place should have burned a long time ago. Margaret glanced around. Maybe it's been waiting. They began searching the study, the drawers, the hidden compartments in the desk. And then, behind a loose panel in the wall, Eli found a leather-bound ledger. Its pages were brittle, filled with numbers, coded transactions, and a few handwritten notes in the judge's familiar scrawl. But at the very back was something unexpected, a letter addressed to Clara Beaumont. "You will never speak of the arrangement," it read. "One child will bear the name, the other will bear the burden. That is the only way this family survives." Margaret whispered, "He knew. He planned it all." Eli's jaw tightened. "No, he didn't just plan it. He orchestrated every lie." He flipped another page and froze. There was a second letter, unsigned, dated years later, addressed to Dr. Harlan. "Our agreement remains. The second boy will never claim his name. If he ever returns, remove him." The ink had bled, but the message was unmistakable. "Remove him." Margaret stepped back, horror spreading across her face. "Eli, this wasn't just about money." "No," he said, his voice low. "It was about legacy, and someone still thinks it's theirs to protect." That night they stayed at a small motel off the highway. Neither slept much. Around midnight, Eli stepped outside for air. The sky was dark, the crickets silent, and then he saw it. Headlights at the far end of the lot. A car idling, engine purring low. He watched as a man stepped out, his face half hidden under a hat. He lit a cigarette, glanced toward their room, then slowly drove off. Eli's pulse quickened. "We've been followed," he said when he returned inside. Margaret's eyes widened. "By who?" He didn't answer, but he knew. The past wasn't done with them yet. The next morning, they drove to Baton Rouge to meet the parish archivist who had helped Margaret access the court files. But when they arrived, the office was sealed off, crime scene tape fluttering in the breeze. The archivist, a middle-aged, man named Simon Drexler, had been found dead in his home that morning. Gunshot wound, no signs of forced entry. Margaret covered her mouth. "Oh my God." Eli clenched his fists. "They're cleaning house." He looked back at the car parked near the courthouse, a black sedan with tinted windows, the same one from the motel lot. Someone was making sure the truth stayed buried. They went into hiding, moving between small towns along the river. Margaret wanted to go to the police, but Eli knew better. "You think the Beaumont name doesn't still buy silence?" he said. "We have to expose them ourselves." Margaret looked at him, frightened, yet determined. "Then how?" Eli thought for a long time. Then he remembered something his mother once said. "People forget what you tell them, Eli, but they never forget what they see." They would make the truth visible. They began gathering everything, the birth records, the ledger, the photos, the letters. They made copies, documented every page. Eli tracked down old friends of Clara's who still remembered the rumors, the pregnancy, the sudden disappearance of a nurse in 1949. Piece by piece, they built a story too heavy to deny. And then, one night, as the rain returned to Louisiana like a ghost's hand, Eli wrote a letter to every major newspaper from Baton Rouge to Washington, D.C., with one simple line at them: "To be, I am the real son of Judge Beaumont, and this is the truth he died trying to bury." The story broke like thunder. Headlines screamed across the South. "Louisiana legacy, family fortune built on switched births. Judge's illegitimate heir speaks out." The photographs, Clara with the judge, the identical birth certificates, spread across national press. The Beaumont estate, already fractured, imploded. Old allies turned on each other. Government investigators reopened the case of Henry Beaumont's death. The media swarmed St. Augustine Parish, digging up bones, both literal and metaphorical. Eli never showed his face. He let the story speak for him. But the man who had followed them, the one with the hat, wasn't done yet. One evening, Margaret returned to their hideout, a small cabin near Lake Pontchartrain, and found the door ajar. The inside was silent, papers scattered across the floor. "Eli?" she called softly. No answer. The window was open, rain blowing in, and there on the table was the bracelet, HB, still gleaming beneath the lamplight. She ran outside, calling his name into the darkness, her voice breaking over the sound of the storm. But the night swallowed every word. Eli Carter, Elias Marrow, was gone. Days later, the police found a burned car near the bayou. Inside, only fragments of fabric and melted glass. No body identified. They ruled it an accident. Margaret didn't believe it. She returned to the motel they'd stayed in, sat alone by the window as rain traced the glass, and whispered, "He kept his promise, Mama Clara. He made them see." The newspapers eventually moved on. The Beaumont name was ruined forever. And in St. Augustine Parish, the locals began saying something strange, that sometimes, when the mist rose off the river at dawn, you could see a man standing near the oak by Clara's grave, his silhouette still as stone, watching the horizon. They said he never spoke, only listened, like a man waiting to be forgiven by the land itself. And whether he was alive or a ghost, nobody knew. But one thing was certain: Louisiana would never forget the Mistress's son. The years crawled forward, slow and heavy like the river after a storm. By the time the decade turned, the world had changed, but Louisiana hadn't. It never truly did. The air still hung thick with memory. The oak still drooped under the weight of moss. And the Beaumont name, though buried, still lingered like perfume on old lace. But to the few who remembered, one ghost never left their thoughts: Elias Marrow, the man the newspapers had called the Louisiana Mistress's son. His story had faded into myth. Some said he'd drowned. Others swore he'd escaped under another name. And a few, mostly the old women who sat on porches at dusk, whispered that he'd made a deal with the river itself. That the water, which had swallowed so many Beaumont secrets, refused to take him. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the storm he'd unleashed had never truly settled. In the spring of 1992, the parish courthouse in St. Augustine was undergoing renovations when a worker's shovel hit metal beneath the old foundation. They unearthed a rusted lockbox, its hinges fused shut. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were documents, letters, bank ledgers, and 2 photographs. One photo showed a young woman holding an infant. The other, an older man standing beside her, face turned from the camera. Written on the back in faded ink, "Clara, July 1949. The discovery reignited old questions. Local journalists dug into archives, and the name Elias Marrow found its way back into headlines. But there was one man who took particular interest: a retired New Orleans detective named Jonas Duval, who'd worked briefly on the Beaumont case back in '82 before being pulled off it for jurisdictional reasons. Jonas had always suspected something bigger. The Beaumont family's reach had been long, their money powerful enough to erase whole investigations. But now, 3 decades later, the soil itself seemed ready to testify. So Jonas returned to Louisiana, gray-haired, limping from an old injury, carrying a leather notebook that smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. He arrived in St. Augustine at dusk, when the river glowed the color of rust and the air buzzed with cicadas. As he stood by the old oak near Clara's grave, he found fresh flowers there, white magnolias, just beginning to wilt. Someone had been here recently. Jonas checked into the same faded motel where the Marrow investigation had once ended in silence. The owner, a woman with cloudy eyes and a cigarette always burning between her fingers, remembered the name instantly. "Elias Marrow," she said. "Lord, that name still makes people whisper." "You a reporter?" "Used to be worse," Jonas said. "Detective." She smiled thinly. "Then you know how to keep secrets." He leaned on the counter. "Not anymore. I came to find one." That night, as thunder rolled across the sky, Jonas sat at the motel desk with a cup of bitter coffee and spread the contents of his old file. Yellowed papers, photographs, witness statements, all pointing to one story: a man who exposed the truth about his birth, toppled a dynasty, and vanished. But there were pieces missing: the coroner's report, the final police dispatch from the night Elias disappeared. The burned car that no one had ever verified belonged to him. Jonas made a note. No confirmation of death, no body. Possible disappearance, not death. And beneath that, another line. If he's alive, where did he go? The next morning, Jonas drove out to the ruins of the Beaumont estate. Only fragments of the house remained. A fireplace swallowed by vines, a cracked stone step where the judge's initials were once carved. But as Jonas walked the grounds, something caught his eye near the tree line. A small wooden cross, half buried in the mud. The engraving was faint, nearly gone with rain, but still legible. EM, 1949. No ending date. Whoever had placed it believed he hadn't died. Later that week, Jonas met with Margaret Beaumont, now living under her married name, Margaret LeClaire. Time had changed her, lines at the corners of her eyes, silver in her hair, but her voice still carried the same quiet strength. "I told them he didn't die," she said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "But nobody wanted to believe me. It was easier to bury him than to admit what they'd done." "You think he faked his death?" Jonas asked. Margaret nodded. "He was tired of fighting. He said once that the only way to kill a name is to disappear from it." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope, its edges brittle. "He sent this to me a year after the paper said he died. No return address, just a single line inside." Jonas unfolded the note carefully. It read, "Don't look for me, Margaret. The river knows my name now." That's enough. There was no signature. But at the bottom of the page was a fingerprint, faint and smeared with oil. The kind that comes from a mechanic's hands. Jonas exhaled slowly. "He lived?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Maybe, but living isn't the same as peace." For months, Jonas followed the ghost of Elias Marrow, through small towns and roadside bars, asking quiet questions and getting quieter answers. Everywhere he went, he found traces of a man who'd been kind but distant, helpful but rootless. A man who fixed broken engines, read the Bible without believing, and always left before dawn. In one town near Lubbock, a widow remembered him as Mr. Carter. He had eyes like he'd seen God and didn't much care for what he saw, she said. In another, a church pastor recalled a stranger who'd repaired the chapel's bell without charging a dime. He said he owed a debt to someone who once taught him silence, the pastor murmured. Jonas knew then Elias hadn't died. He'd been haunting the living world in plain sight. But there was something else Jonas didn't yet understand. If Elias had escaped, who'd burned the car? Who'd killed the archivist? Who was still protecting the Beaumont legacy after all these years? But the answer came one sweltering evening in late July. Jonas returned to his motel room to find the door unlocked. Inside, on the table, lay a single object, a photograph. It was recent. A man sitting outside a rural gas station, cigarette in hand, wearing a grease-stained jacket. His hair grayer, his beard unkempt, but the eyes unmistakable. Elias Marrow. On the back of the photo, a handwritten note. "You're looking in the wrong direction. The river isn't where it ends, it's where it begins." No signature, but Jonas recognized the handwriting. It wasn't Elias's, it was Henry's. For hours, Jonas sat staring at the note. Henry Beaumont had been dead for nearly a decade, or so the report said. But what if that too was a lie? What if the family's darkest secret hadn't been about the birth switch, but about survival itself? He cross-checked the coroner's files. Henry's autopsy report had been signed by the same coroner who'd handled Judge Beaumont's burial, Dr. Lowell Crane. A man later investigated for falsifying records in multiple high-profile cases. Jonas felt his pulse quicken. "No confirmation of body," he whispered. "Only identification through personal effects. If Henry had lived, he'd had decades to rebuild what Elias destroyed. And that meant Elias, wherever he was still in danger." 2 weeks later, Jonas followed a trail that led him to the edge of the Red River near Shreveport. A mechanic's shop had recently been sold, its previous owner disappearing overnight. The locals described him perfectly, middle-aged, quiet, with an old scar near his collarbone. Jonas arrived at sunset. The shop was empty except for the smell of oil and rust. But near the back wall, written in dust with a fingertip, were 3 words. "It never ends." Jonas stepped back, heart pounding. Then he heard it, the faint crunch of gravel outside. He turned, just in time to see a figure watching from the tree line. A man in a wide-brimmed hat, cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. For a moment, neither moved. Then the man turned and vanished into the trees. Jonas chased after him, flashlight beams slicing through the dark. But the woods swallowed the light whole. When he finally stopped, breath ragged, he heard something in the distance, the sound of a car engine fading away. That night, as he sat by the river, Jonas replayed everything he'd learned. The lies, the bloodline, the missing men. Louisiana didn't just hide its dead, it protected them. Maybe Elias had survived. Maybe Henry had, too. Maybe the two halves of the Beaumont legacy were still circling each other, waiting for one final reckoning. Jonas took out his notebook, scribbled a final line. Truth in Louisiana isn't found in graves. It walks. He closed the book, staring at the river's dark reflection. For a moment, he thought he saw movement. Two silhouettes standing at opposite banks, facing each other. But when he blinked, there was only water, endless and silent. Months later, the locals told a new story about two men seen wandering near the old Beaumont land. Always at dusk, always alone. Some said one of them was the ghost of the judge, still guarding his sins. Others said they were brothers, bound by blood, divided by truth, meeting once more before the river finally took them both. No one ever proved it. But sometimes, when the fog lifted just right and the moon caught the water like silver glass, people swore they could hear voices, low, steady, almost prayerful, whispering beneath the sound of the current, words too faint to catch, but heavy with finality. And the river, ancient and patient, kept flowing, carrying the last of the Beaumont story out to sea. The fog never really lifted from the Beaumont lands. Even when the sun burned through the morning haze, the air felt thick, as if the ghosts of what had happened there refused to let the light in. By the time Jonas Duval returned for the last time, autumn had begun to strip the trees bare. The river was low, sluggish, and red with clay. He'd spent 3 months chasing whispers, one name always surfacing again and again, Elias Marrow. But this time, it wasn't just his name, it was his death. A fisherman downriver claimed to have found a boot tangled in reeds. Inside it, a rusted locket. Inside the locket, 2 faded photos. A woman holding a newborn, and a boy standing beside a house now swallowed by vines. Jonas knew that photo. He'd seen it in the courthouse lockbox months ago. So he went, one last time, to where it all began, the edge of the Beaumont estate, where the cypress trees leaned like mourners and the soil still smelled of rain and iron. As dusk bled into night, Jonas found himself drawn toward the broken fireplace, all that remained of the mansion. He noticed something carved into the soot-stained brick, half hidden under moss. We returned to what we tried to forget. He knelt, tracing the words with his fingers. That's when he heard it. Soft, steady behind him, footsteps. He turned, hand instinctively going to the revolver at his side. A man stood at the tree line, face hidden in shadow, shoulders slightly hunched like someone carrying too much memory. The man stepped forward into the pale light, and Jonas's breath caught. It was Elias Marrow. Older, thinner, with silver streaking through his beard, but unmistakable. The same eyes, the same quiet gravity that had haunted every photograph and rumor. "You found me," Elias said, his voice calm, low, as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. "I wasn't sure you were real," Jonas said. "They said you died." Elias gave a weary smile. "In Louisiana, people die on paper long before they die in truth." Jonas stepped closer. "Why come back here after all these years?" Elias looked toward the river. "To bury what's left," he said. "To end it before someone else starts it again." "Henry?" Jonas asked quietly. Elias nodded once. "He's alive. Has been for years. Different name now. Lives in Texas. Runs oil money through old Beaumont accounts. Thought he could outrun the bloodline." Jonas felt his stomach turn. "And you came back to kill him?" Elias's silence was answer enough. The wind picked up. Thunder rolled far off, as if the sky itself was listening. Jonas said, "You know, you could have lived a life. Started over. You didn't have to come back." Elias's jaw tightened. "I did. Because the river doesn't forget, Detective. You can't build peace on bones that were never buried right." He turned, staring at the black water below. "My mother, Clara, she told me once that the Beaumont name was a curse that fed on silence. I thought exposing them would break it. I was wrong. It only made the silence louder." Jonas's voice dropped to a whisper. "And Henry?" Elias sighed. "He's the last of them, and when he dies, maybe the land will finally breathe again." Before Jonas could speak, a light flickered in the distance, headlights cutting through the trees. A black car, slow and deliberate, stopped just short of the ruins. A man stepped out. Older, heavy-set, wearing a dark coat despite the heat. He moved like someone used to command, slow, precise, every gesture carrying weight. Henry Beaumont. Jonas felt the tension thicken between them. Two men who shared blood but not mercy. Henry's voice was deep, ragged with age. "So, it's true. You're still alive." Elias's eyes never left him. "You should have stayed dead, Henry." Henry laughed, a sound that carried no joy. "I learned from the best. You can't kill what's already been forgotten." He stepped closer, the glow from the car's headlights framing his face. And for a moment Jonas saw it. The resemblance. Not just in bone and brow, but in the quiet madness of both men. "You burned everything," Elias said. "The records, the graves, the truth." "I preserved order," Henry hissed. "The world runs on lies. You just weren't strong enough to live with them." "I wasn't strong enough to become you." Henry's lip curled. "Then you'll die like her, poor, pitiful, and alone." Elias's hand trembled slightly, and Jonas realized there was a gun in it. But his voice stayed calm. "She died for something." "Henry, you'll die for nothing." For a long, suspended second, no one moved. Then thunder cracked, and a gunshot split the silence. Jonas ducked, heart hammering. When the echo faded, Henry was on the ground, clutching his chest, breath rattling out in gasps. Elias stood frozen, staring at the gun in his hand like it wasn't his own. Blood seeped into the mud, black under the lightning. Henry tried to speak, but only managed a whisper. "You think killing me changes anything?" Elias knelt beside him. "It changes everything." Henry smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "No, you just took my place." His eyes went glassy. The last Beaumont exhaled, and the rain began to fall. By morning, the body was gone. The rain had swelled the river, and the current had taken it before anyone could find proof. Jonas filed no report. He told no one what he saw. When the sheriff asked if there was anything left at the Beaumont site, he simply said, "No, just ghosts." Weeks later, Jonas received a package at his New Orleans apartment. No return address. Inside, a small, weathered Bible. On the inside cover, in familiar handwriting, were the words, "The river took what it wanted. I'm leaving what it can't, the truth. Burn this if you want peace. Read it if you want answers. Inside the Bible were pages filled with names, dates, and ledgers, a full record of the Beaumont corruption spanning generations. Elias had exposed it all, quietly, finally. Jonas never told anyone where the information came from. He just left it on a journalist's doorstep one morning and walked away. That winter, a man matching Elias's description was seen in Mississippi, then Alabama, then never again. Some say he boarded a cargo ship under another name. Some say he drowned in the same river that raised him. But the old folks in St. Augustine, the ones who remember everything, still leave flowers at the broken fireplace every year, white magnolias. They say it's not for forgiveness, it's for freedom. Years later, when the Beaumont estate was finally cleared to build a public park, workers digging by the river found two things buried under the mud: a rusted revolver and a locket, still sealed tight. Inside, the same photo, Clara and her baby. Only now, new words had been etched on the back. The river remembers. The blood forgets. The camera pans out slowly. The ruins, the river, the fog curling like smoke over the water. A faint voice echoes, Elias's, soft and resolute. Names fade. Truth sinks. But somewhere beneath the mud, it still breathes. And then silence. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out.